A prince who should have been king, a curse in his blood, a love that made him abandon the throne, 2 failed marriages, a tragic death at the age of 31 in a car accident. No, this is not a Hollywood script. This is the real life of Alfonso, the unfortunate heir to the Spanish throne. Today's video will delve into this tragedy to see how a man who had it all ended up with nothing. And more importantly, how his life's downfall inadvertently became the foundation of modern Spain. Everything will be revealed. In 1898, Spain suffered a humiliating defeat in the Spanish-American War, losing the last remnants of its mighty empire, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. This was more than a military loss. It was a crisis of national identity. Into this anxious nation came King Alfonso XIII, the prince's father. He was a modern man who loved fast cars, but he ruled with an old-world belief in absolute power. His constant meddling in politics created chaos, with over 30 different governments in 20 years. Spain was a powder keg of poverty, anarchism, and separatism. Then came the decision that sealed his son's fate. The king chose to marry for love, selecting the beautiful Victoria Eugenia of Battenberg, Queen Victoria's granddaughter. But this love story came with a terrible secret. The British royal family carried the gene for hemophilia, the royal disease. Despite being warned, the king took the gamble. It was a bet he would lose spectacularly, cursing his firstborn son and heir, and setting the stage for a personal and dynastic tragedy. The consequences of that fateful bet became a living reality in their firstborn son, forging a childhood where every moment of fragility was a step closer to death. Imagine a childhood where the word no is not about discipline, but about survival. Imagine a world where a grassy lawn is a field of potential hazards, where a friendly game of tag is a forbidden danger, and where a loving hug, if too firm, could cause a painful internal bruise. This was the world of young Alfonso, Prince of Asturias. His life within the opulent, cavernous walls of the royal palace of Madrid was less that of a fairy tale prince and more that of a precious, fragile artifact kept under glass, perpetually shielded from the world. His hemophilia, the dark inheritance from his mother's side, was not just a medical condition. It was the architect of his existence, the silent, invisible force that built the walls of his isolation and dictated the terms of his every waking moment. From the instant his condition was confirmed, a new shadow court assembled around the young prince. This was not a court of ministers and aristocrats, but one of physicians in starched collars, stern-faced nurses imported from England, and his own mother, Queen Ina, who transformed from a radiant young queen into the sleepless commander of this tiny army of protectors. Her life, already strained by a resentful husband in a foreign court, now found its singular, all-consuming focus, keeping her firstborn son alive. The vast royal apartments that were Alfonso's domain were subtly and then radically transformed. The magnificent marble floors, so perfect for the clatter of royal boots and the rustle of silk gowns, were covered in thick plush Persian carpets to cushion any potential fall. The sharp, ornate corners of priceless Baroque furniture, carved by master craftsmen centuries ago, were discreetly padded with velvet buffers. His world became a soft, muffled place, a fortress of fabric and caution. His nursery, and later his playroom, was less a place of youthful joy and more a carefully controlled medical environment. His toys were vetted with the seriousness of a state secret. The traditional gift for a young prince, a finely crafted wooden sword or a set of lead soldiers, was deemed too dangerous. He could have the soldiers, yes, but they were to be arranged in static, bloodless dioramas on a table, never to be hurled in mock battle. His toys were soft, yielding things. Cloth dolls, stuffed animals, and picture books with thick, rounded pages. These books became his true kingdom. While other boys were learning to climb trees, Alfonso was learning to navigate the world through intricate maps and lavishly illustrated histories. He could trace the voyages of Magellan and the conquests of the Catholic monarchs, his fingers gliding over pages that represented a world of action and adventure that was, for him, a complete fantasy. His windows, draped in heavy velvet, often looked out onto the Campo del Moro gardens or the Gran Plaza de la Armeria, where he could watch his siblings and the children of courtiers playing games he could never join. He was a spectator king in a kingdom of one. The contrast with his siblings was a daily painful lesson in the cruelty of genetic chance. His brother Jaime, born just a year after him and rendered deaf by a childhood illness, was his closest companion in suffering. They were the two flawed princes. They developed their own silent language of gestures and expressions, a private world that no one else could fully enter. Their bond was forged in the shared experience of being different, of being defined by their physical limitations. But the most profound and difficult contrast was with his third brother, Juan. Born in 1913, Juan was everything Alfonso was not: healthy, robust, energetic, and free. Juan was the living embodiment of the Bourbon ideal. He was destined for a career in the Spanish Navy, a path that promised adventure, discipline, and masculine prowess. While Alfonso's uniform was a specially made padded suit for indoor play, Juan was proudly fitted for miniature sailors' uniforms, his days filled with the exciting prospect of learning to command ships and navigate the open seas. Imagine the scene, repeated countless times throughout their childhood. Juan, his cheeks flushed with excitement, would burst into Alfonso's quiet, temperature-controlled rooms, smelling of fresh air and horsehide, chattering about a riding lesson or a game of football he had just played in the gardens. Alfonso, sitting carefully in a high-backed chair, his leg perhaps propped on a cushion to ease the ache of a recent bleed, could only listen. What must that have felt like? It was surely a complex cocktail of emotions, a deep, genuine brotherly love mixed with a corrosive, inescapable envy. He loved Juan, but Juan's very existence, his effortless vitality, was a constant, painful reminder of everything Alfonso had been denied. He was the heir, but Juan was the hope. And everyone in the palace, from the king down to the lowest-ranking scullery maid, knew it. His relationship with his parents was the central axis of his young life's drama. Queen Ina's love for him was a fierce, all-encompassing force. It was a love born of guilt, the terrible, irrational guilt that she had passed this curse on to him, and a desperate need to find meaning in a court that had come to despise her. She was his chief nurse, his advocate, his everything. She would spend hours reading to him in her native English, creating a little bubble of British culture within the Spanish court, which only served to further alienate her from the aristocracy. She personally supervised his meals, his lessons, his every interaction, her face a constant mask of loving anxiety. Her love was his greatest comfort, but it was also another layer of his gilded cage, a mother's love so protective it risked suffocating him entirely. His father, King Alfonso XIII, was a far more complicated and distant figure. The king was a man of action, a sportsman, a soldier at heart. He loved the thunder of polo ponies, the roar of a Hispano-Suiza engine, the crisp snap of a military salute. In his firstborn son, he saw a reflection of everything he was not: frail, sedentary, delicate. The king's disappointment was a palpable presence in the room whenever he visited his son's apartments. He would try, in his own awkward way, to bridge the chasm between them. He would bring Alfonso magnificent, intricately detailed model ships or regiments of perfectly painted toy soldiers, trying to impart the martial spirit of kingship through inanimate objects. But their interactions were strained. The king, restless and bursting with energy, could not sit still for long in the quiet, sterile atmosphere of the sick room. He loved his son, but he did not understand him, and he could never fully forgive the genetic lottery that had produced an heir who could be broken by a fall. This paternal disappointment was perhaps the heaviest burden the young prince had to bear, heavier even than the crown he was destined to inherit. The physical reality of his illness was a recurring nightmare. A single seemingly innocuous event could trigger weeks of agony. Perhaps a stumble on a carpet, a door swung open too quickly, a moment of incautious play. The initial incident would seem minor, but hours later, the telltale signs would begin. A deep internal ache in a knee or an elbow, a feeling of tightness as the joint capsule began to fill with blood. Then came the swelling, the joint becoming hot, taut, and grotesquely discolored. And then came the pain. It was not a sharp, clean pain, but a relentless, throbbing, deep-seated agony that contemporary accounts from other hemophiliacs describe as feeling like the joint is being slowly pulled apart from the inside. The medical treatments of the 1910s and 1920s were primitive and often brutal. There were no clotting factor concentrates to stop the bleeding. The first line of defense was absolute immobilization. The limb would be encased in a plaster cast or a painful system of splints and braces, forcing the young boy to lie perfectly still for days, sometimes weeks, on end. The only relief from the pain came from opiates like laudanum, which left him drowsy and disconnected. When the swelling was severe, the doctors would resort to arthrocentesis, the draining of the joint. Imagine a young boy, held down by nurses, watching as a doctor approached with a large, terrifying hypodermic needle and plunged it deep into the swollen joint to aspirate the dark, viscous blood. Without the benefit of modern anesthetics, the procedure itself was an excruciating torture, undertaken only to relieve the greater torture of the pressure buildup. After the crisis passed, he would be left weakened, his muscles atrophied, often with a new, permanent limp or a joint that could no longer fully extend. His body was a map of his own suffering, each joint a repository of painful memories. This shielded, painful existence unfolded against a backdrop of national upheaval that grew more and more violent. While Alfonso was learning French and German with his tutors, Spanish soldiers were dying in the mountains of North Africa in the brutal, seemingly endless Rif War. This colonial conflict was a festering sore on the national consciousness, draining the treasury and consuming the lives of thousands of conscripts. In 1921 came the second great disaster of the era, the Battle of Annual. A badly led and ill-equipped Spanish army was annihilated by Moroccan tribesmen. Over 13,000 Spanish soldiers were killed in a shocking military catastrophe that sent shockwaves all the way back to Madrid. The public was enraged, demanding to know who was responsible. The investigation pointed fingers all the way up to the highest echelons of the army, and by implication to the king himself, who was the commander-in-chief. The political system, already fragile, began to completely disintegrate. Strikes paralyzed Barcelona. Anarchist bombs exploded in city streets. The government was powerless. It was in this atmosphere of chaos and national crisis that the military finally stepped in. On September 13th, 1923, General Miguel Primo de Rivera, the Captain General of Catalonia, launched a coup d'etat. He declared martial law and demanded the resignation of the government. King Alfonso XIII seeing the coup as the only way to restore order and perhaps save his throne from a full-blown revolution, made a fateful decision. He supported it. He dismissed the civilian government and appointed Primo de Rivera as prime minister with dictatorial powers. Parliament was dissolved, the constitution suspended. Spain traded its dysfunctional democracy for a military dictatorship. For the 16-year-old Prince Alfonso, this was a profound and likely confusing political education. From his isolated vantage point within the palace, he would have witnessed his father's desperate gamble. He would have heard the arguments and the rationalizations that this was a temporary measure, a necessary surgery to save the sick patient of Spain. He was being taught that sometimes a king must act outside the law to preserve the nation. But he would also have been aware of the deep divisions this caused. The liberal monarchists who felt betrayed, the Republicans who were now more energized than ever. He was the heir to a throne that was now propped up not by the will of the people or the sanctity of a constitution, but by the power of the army. The foundations of his future kingdom were being replaced with something much more brittle and dangerous. The glass tower he lived in, designed to protect him from the world, was proving to be no defense at all against the seismic political tremors that were shaking his country to its very core. He was a prince coming of age in a kingdom that was losing its way. His own physical fragility, a haunting metaphor for the fragility of the crown he was one day supposed to wear. As the 1920s drew to a close, the glass tower that had been Prince Alfonso's entire world began to develop deep structural cracks, not from within, but from the immense, unrelenting pressure of the world outside. The dictatorship of General Primo de Rivera, which his father King Alfonso XIII had endorsed in 1923, had been a desperate gamble to impose order on a chaotic nation. For a time, it seemed to work. The street violence subsided, and massive public works projects, new roads, dams, and railways gave the illusion of progress and modernity. But this stability was a facade, built on borrowed money and the brutal suppression of all political dissent. It was a regime that could not and would not last. The opposition, driven underground, began to fester and grow more organized. Spain's great intellectuals, men like the philosopher Miguel de Unamuno, were sent into exile for their criticism of the regime, becoming martyrs for the cause of liberty. University students in Madrid and Barcelona held clandestine meetings and organized protests that were often met with police batons. Most dangerously for the king, the very institution he relied upon, the army, was beginning to turn against the dictator. Primo de Rivera's attempts to reform the powerful artillery corps created deep resentment among the officer class. The king, who had always seen himself as a soldier first and a politician second, found himself caught between his dictator and his army. The final fatal blow came not from a bomb or a bullet, but from the ticker tapes of Wall Street. The great crash of 1929 sent a tidal wave of economic devastation across the globe, and Spain, whose prosperity under the dictatorship was largely illusory, was hit hard. Foreign loans dried up. The Spanish peseta plummeted in value. Unemployment soared. The regime, which had staked its legitimacy on economic success, was now exposed as a failure. By the end of 1929, Primo de Rivera was an isolated and exhausted man, his support base having evaporated entirely. In a moment of profound miscalculation, King Alfonso XIII decided the dictator was now a liability. In January 1930, he withdrew his support, forcing Primo de Rivera to resign and slip quietly into exile in Paris, where he would die just weeks later. The king believed he could now simply turn back the clock to 1923. He appointed another general, Damaso Berenguer, to head a new government with the goal of slowly returning to the old constitutional system. But the Spanish people were in no mood to forgive or forget. They had endured 7 years of dictatorship, and they laid the blame squarely at the feet of the one man who had enabled it, the king himself. The Berenguer government was so weak and ineffectual that it was widely mocked as the dicta blanda, the soft dictatorship, a pathetic sequel to the dictadura, hard dictatorship, that had preceded it. The king had hoped for a gradual, controlled return to normalcy. What he got was an explosion of Republican fervor. In August 1930, a crucial meeting took place in the Basque coastal city of San Sebastian. There, representatives from every major Republican party, from conservative Catholics to radical socialists, along with Catalan and Basque nationalists, gathered to form a united front. This Pact of San Sebastian created a revolutionary committee with a single clear objective: to overthrow the monarchy and establish a republic. The king's opponents were no longer a fractured collection of disgruntled intellectuals. They were now an organized, determined government in waiting. They even attempted a military coup in December 1930, which, although it failed, showed the depth of anti-monarchist sentiment within the armed forces. The two captains who led the failed uprising were executed, turning them into celebrated martyrs for the Republican cause. Faced with a political situation that was spiraling out of his control, the king and his government made one last fateful roll of the dice. They announced that municipal elections would be held on Sunday, April 12th, 1931. In their minds, this was a safe, low-stakes election. It was about choosing mayors and local councilors, not deciding the fate of the nation. They were confident that the traditional monarchist bosses who controlled the rural vote would ensure a comfortable, if meaningless, victory. The Republican coalition, however, saw the elections for what they truly were: a plebiscite on the very existence of the monarchy. They campaigned with a ferocious energy, transforming a local vote into a national referendum. Their message was simple: a vote for a Republican councilor was a vote against the king. For Prince Alfonso, now 23 years old, these events must have been a terrifying spectacle. His entire life had been spent in the rarefied air of the palace, shielded from the raw, messy reality of his country's politics. Now the walls were no longer soundproof. He would have heard the worried conversations of his father with his ministers, seen the grim faces of the generals coming and going, and felt the palpable sense of a world coming undone. He was the heir to a throne that was visibly sinking into the ground, and there was nothing he or anyone could do to stop it. The election day itself was largely peaceful. The results began to trickle in that evening and into the next day, Monday, April 13th. As the government had predicted, the monarchist parties won a majority of the total council seats, thanks to their grip on the thousands of small rural villages. But this was a statistical illusion that hid a devastating political reality. In every major city, in every provincial capital where the vote was truly free, the Republicans had won by landslides. Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, Seville, Bilbao, the urban, industrial, and intellectual heart of the nation, had voted overwhelmingly for a republic. The headline in the monarchist newspaper ABC on Tuesday, April 14th, tried to spin the numbers, but the political meaning was undeniable. As one of the king's own ministers, Count Romanones, grimly put it, "The results of the election have been disastrous for us. The monarchists have been defeated." Tuesday, April 14th, 1931, was the day the Spanish monarchy collapsed. The morning began with an eerie quiet, the calm before the storm. But as the full scale of the Republican victory became clear, the streets began to fill. In the town of Eibar, in the Basque country, the red, gold, and purple tricolor of the Second Republic was hoisted above the town hall, the first to do so. The news spread like wildfire. In Barcelona, the charismatic Catalan leader Francesc Macià declared a Catalan republic. And in Madrid, the streets around the Puerta del Sol swelled with vast, joyous crowds chanting, "Viva la República!" It was a bloodless, festive revolution, a transfer of power driven by popular will. Inside the royal palace, the atmosphere was one of panic and despair. The king held a frantic series of meetings. Some of his hardline advisors urged him to use the army to clear the streets and declare martial law. But the king, for all his faults, was not a tyrant who would turn his army on his own people. He summoned General José Sanjurjo, the formidable head of the Guardia Civil, the state's most powerful police force. The king asked Sanjurjo if he could count on the loyalty of his men. The general's reply sealed the king's fate. "Your Majesty, I cannot." He could not guarantee that his men would fire on the celebrating crowds. The monarchy had lost its last line of defense. The king's ministers advised him that his position was untenable. To stay would mean plunging Spain into a civil war, a horror he was determined to avoid. The decision was made. He would leave. That afternoon he gathered his family in one of the grand salons. It was a scene of profound and hurried sorrow. He told his wife and 7 children that he was leaving Spain to prevent bloodshed, but that he was not abdicating. He still considered himself king, and he held on to the hope that one day his people would call him back. For Prince Alfonso, this moment must have been the shattering culmination of a lifetime of anxiety. The abstract threat he had lived with his entire life had become a stark reality. He was losing his home, his country, and his birthright all at once. That evening, as darkness fell over Madrid, King Alfonso XIII said his final tearful goodbyes. He slipped out of the palace through a side door, got into a car, and was driven at high speed through the night to the port of Cartagena. There, he boarded a Spanish naval cruiser and sailed into a long and bitter exile. The next morning, Queen Ina and the royal children, including Prince Alfonso, made their own departure. They walked through the now empty palace, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous halls, and took a train from Madrid's Escorial station. As the train pulled away, they looked out the windows at the country that was no longer theirs, a country now celebrating the dawn of a new Republican era. Their first stop was Paris, where they checked into the luxurious Hotel Meurice. But the glamour of their surroundings could not mask the harsh reality of their new situation. They were no longer the ruling family of a great nation. They were refugees, albeit very wealthy ones. They were stateless, living out of suitcases, their future a vast, terrifying unknown. The family eventually settled for a time in Fontainebleau, outside Paris, before moving to Rome. For Prince Alfonso, the upheaval was profound. The rigid structure of his life, the constant medical supervision, the suffocating protocol of the Spanish court, it all vanished overnight. On the one hand, he had lost the purpose that had defined him, the destiny he had been preparing for his entire life. On the other hand, he had been granted an unexpected, dizzying freedom. For the first time, he was not the Prince of Asturias, heir to a throne. He was simply Alfonso de Bourbon, a young man with a title, a private fortune, and a serious illness, trying to figure out who he was in a world that had been turned upside down. It was this search for a new life and the constant need for medical attention that led him to the tranquil city of Lausanne in Switzerland. Nestled on the shores of Lake Geneva, Lausanne was known for its world-class clinics and sanatoriums, a peaceful haven for the ailing elite of Europe. Alfonso was there for treatment, to consult with specialists who might offer some new hope for managing the debilitating effects of his hemophilia. He was a patient, a prince in a quiet medical exile. And it was there, in the sterile, ordered world of a Swiss sanatorium, that his life took another dramatic, unforeseen turn. It was there that he met Edelmira San Pedro Robato y Ochejo. Edelmira was a sunbeam in the cool alpine air of Lausanne. She was a world away from the pale, aristocratic princesses Alfonso had grown up around. She was a Cuban, born in Sagua la Grande, the daughter of a fabulously wealthy sugar merchant. Her family personified the New World aristocracy of commerce, not the ancient landed nobility of Europe. She was beautiful, yes, but it was her spirit that was most captivating. She was possessed of a Caribbean warmth, a directness, and a joyful lack of pretension that was utterly intoxicating. She was educated, witty, and moved through the world with an easy confidence that came from a life lived far from the rigid strictures of a royal court. The exact moment of their meeting is the stuff of romantic legend, but it was electric. For Alfonso, meeting Edelmira was like stepping out of a dimly lit room into the bright sunshine. She did not see him as the tragic, exiled heir to the Spanish throne. She was not impressed by his title or his lineage. She saw a young man, intelligent and gentle, but also sad and profoundly lonely. She saw the person behind the prince, and she treated him with a simple, unaffected kindness that he had never known. She wasn't afraid to laugh with him, to challenge him, to treat him, in short, like a normal human being. For Edelmira, the attraction was just as powerful. She saw in Alfonso not the weakness his father had always lamented, but a quiet strength. She saw a man who had endured a lifetime of physical pain and emotional isolation with a remarkable dignity. His vulnerability, far from being a liability, was something that touched her deeply. She was a strong, nurturing woman, and her heart went out to this prince who seemed to have lost everything. Their courtship unfolded in the quiet cafes and lakeside promenades of Lausanne. They talked for hours, sharing the stories of their impossibly different worlds. He described the cold, echoing halls of the Escorial, and she described the vibrant, noisy streets of Havana. In each other, they found a refuge and a sense of belonging that their lives had otherwise denied them. A deep, passionate, and utterly impossible love began to grow. It was a love that would force Alfonso to make the most difficult choice of his life, a choice between the ghostly crown of his ancestors and the living, breathing reality of the woman who had finally shown him what it meant to be truly seen. The love that blossomed between Prince Alfonso and Edelmira San Pedro on the serene shores of Lake Geneva was a private paradise, a refuge from a world of politics, exile, and painful medical realities. But paradise cannot exist in a vacuum. The news of the relationship between the heir to the Spanish throne and a Cuban commoner inevitably reached his family, and the idyllic Swiss bubble burst with the force of a dynastic explosion. The reaction from his father, the exiled king Alfonso XIII, was not merely one of disapproval, it was one of absolute apoplectic fury. This was not just a father concerned about his son's unsuitable match. This was a king witnessing what he believed to be the potential ruin of his life's entire purpose, the restoration of the House of Bourbon to the throne of Spain. The conflict that ensued was a bitter and agonizing war of words, waged through crackling long-distance telephone calls and a barrage of letters between Rome, where the exiled king held his court, and Lausanne, where the prince had found his heart. For the king, his son's infatuation was an act of profound betrayal. He saw it as a dereliction of the most sacred duty a prince has. In his letters, he would have appealed to every conceivable argument. He would have invoked the weight of 1,000 years of history, the sacrifices of their ancestors, the Bourbon blood that flowed in their veins. He would have reminded Alfonso of the loyal monarchists still in Spain, risking their freedom and their lives for the cause of restoration, a cause that would be critically weakened if the heir apparent appeared to be a frivolous playboy casting aside his destiny for a woman of no royal standing. The king, a product of a world where marriage was the ultimate tool of statecraft, simply could not comprehend a union based on personal happiness alone. To him, it was a profound act of selfishness. He would have painted a damning picture of Edelmira, not as a person, for he had likely never met her, but as a symbol. She was an adventuress, a social climber, a woman who was seducing his son away from his responsibilities. He would have stressed the legal and dynastic impossibilities of the union. According to the Pragmatic Sanction of 1776, a cornerstone of Spanish royal law, members of the royal family were forbidden from marrying individuals of unequal rank. To do so would mean immediate forfeiture of all succession rights for oneself and one's descendants. This was not a matter for debate. It was immutable law. The choice was stark and absolute: Edelmira or the throne. There was no middle ground. The king likely issued ultimatums, threatening to cut Alfonso off financially and ostracize him from the family entirely if he did not end this disastrous affair. Caught in this emotional crossfire was Queen Ina. Her position was excruciatingly complex. As a queen, she understood the ironclad laws of dynasty. She, too, had been chosen for a royal marriage, and she knew the sacrifices it entailed. Yet as a mother, her heart ached for her son. She, more than anyone, knew the depth of his physical and emotional suffering. She had watched him live a life of pain, isolation, and constant caution. How could she deny him a chance at genuine love and happiness, perhaps the only chance he would ever have? Furthermore, Ina herself had married for love, and she had been blamed her entire married life for the genetic taint she brought to the family. She understood what it meant to be an outsider, and she likely felt a secret sympathy for the woman her son had chosen. She would have tried to act as a mediator, urging her husband to be more understanding and pleading with her son to consider the consequences. Her letters likely filled with a mother's anguish, torn between her duty as a queen and her love for her child. The rest of the royal family was also thrown into turmoil. The decision most directly impacted Alfonso's younger brother, Juan. Juan was the quintessential dutiful son. He was pursuing his naval career, embodying the robust, active ideal that his father so admired. He had always been the spare, living with the knowledge that his brother stood between him and the throne. Now he was being thrust into the forefront. Alfonso's love affair was about to make him the heir. This was not a position he had sought, and it came with an immense and sudden weight. He loved his brother, but he was also a man of deep tradition. He would have likely sided with his father on the matter of duty, seeing Alfonso's choice as a lamentable but clear violation of their royal obligations. The dynamic between the brothers, already complicated by Alfonso's illness, was now strained by this ultimate divergence of paths. One choosing a personal life, the other accepting the full burden of their family's legacy. But the arguments and threats from Rome fundamentally misjudged the man Alfonso had become. The boy who had spent his life in a glass tower, having every decision made for him, had finally found something he was willing to fight for. His love for Edelmira was intertwined with his first real taste of personal agency. Choosing her was choosing a life for himself. His quiet, melancholic nature concealed a core of stubborn resolve, forged in a lifetime of enduring pain. he was also armed with a powerful, unassailable argument of his own. In his replies to his father, he could have laid out the brutal truth of his own condition. What kind of king, he might have asked, would he truly be? A king who could be incapacitated for weeks by a simple fall, a monarch who could not review his troops on horseback for fear of a fatal hemorrhage, a sovereign whose life was a constant draining battle against his own body. More than that, there was the terrifying prospect of passing the royal disease on to the next generation. If he were to marry a European princess and produce an heir, there was a 50% chance any daughter of his would be a carrier, just like his mother, destined to live in fear and potentially pass the disease on. Any son could be born a hemophiliac, doomed to the same life of suffering he had endured. Was it not, he could argue, a greater act of duty to the dynasty to step aside, to allow his healthy, robust brother Juan to carry the line forward, to ensure that the future king of Spain would be strong in body as well as in spirit? In this light, his renunciation was not an act of selfish love, but one of profound forward-thinking responsibility. It was a sacrifice for the good of the crown. This powerful logical argument, combined with the unshakable emotional reality of his love for Edelmira, made his position impenetrable. His conversations with Edelmira in Lausanne would have solidified his resolve. She offered him not a crown, but a life. She did not promise him glory or power, but companionship, care, and normalcy. She was not afraid of his illness. She had already demonstrated her willingness to be his nurse, his protector, his partner in managing the daily challenges of his condition. With her, he was not a fragile symbol of a fallen dynasty. He was simply Alfonso, a man she loved. She represented a complete break from the cold, formal, and painful world of his past. The choice became clearer and clearer. His father offered him a ghostly crown in a kingdom that might never exist again. Edelmira offered him a real, tangible life here and now. He made his choice. The formal act of renunciation was a somber and historic occasion. On June 11, 1933, in a hotel or a lawyer's office in Lausanne, the final irrevocable step was taken. The scene would have been thick with tension. On one side, Prince Alfonso, quiet and determined. On the other, his father, King Alfonso XIII, who had traveled there to witness the act, his face a mask of grim, sorrowful resignation. The document itself would have been a cold, legalistic instrument, its formal language stripping away a birthright. By signing it, Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, voluntarily and forever relinquished all his rights to the throne of Spain, for himself and for all his descendants. The moment the ink was dry on the parchment, his destiny and the destiny of his family was irrevocably altered. The title of Prince of Asturias and the position of heir to the defunct throne passed instantly to his brother, Juan. The main branch of the Spanish Bourbons had been pruned. In a final poignant gesture, the king did not cast his son out entirely. He bestowed upon him a new lesser title, Count of Covadonga. The choice was steeped in centuries of Spanish history. Covadonga was the mountain valley in Asturias where, in the 8th century, a small band of Christians had won the first victory against the Moorish invaders, beginning the nearly 800-year-long Reconquista. It was a title that evoked the very genesis of the Spanish kingdom. By giving his son this name, the king was perhaps making a final, silent plea, a reminder of the monumental legacy he was abandoning. Alfonso was now the Count of Covadonga, a title that looked back to the very beginning of Spain, just as he was stepping away from its future. With the dynastic drama concluded, Alfonso moved with astonishing speed to claim his prize. Just 10 days after signing away his kingdom, on June 21, 1933, he married Edelmira Sampedro in a simple civil ceremony in Ouchy, a lakeside district of Lausanne. The contrast with his parents' wedding could not have been more dramatic. There was no procession through cheering crowds, no grand cathedral, no spattering of an assassin's bomb. The ceremony took place in a quiet, functional registry office. The bride wore a fashionable dress and hat, not a diamond tiara and a gown of state. The groom was a man in a well-cut suit, not a king in a military uniform dripping with medals. The guest list consisted of a small handful of loyal friends and members of Edelmira's family. Conspicuously, tragically absent was anyone from the Spanish royal family. It was a union celebrated in defiance of their wishes, and they would not grant it their presence. The international press, however, treated the event as a global sensation. Newspapers from Paris to New York ran front-page stories breathlessly recounting the tale of the prince who chose love. It was framed as the ultimate fairy tale, a 20th century romance that proved love could conquer all, even the ancient demands of a European throne. Alfonso and his new wife, now the Countess of Covadonga, were for a time the most famous couple in the world, hounded by photographers and reporters. Their new life began, as many do, with a honeymoon period of blissful optimism. They lived for a time in Paris, trying to carve out a private existence amidst the glare of public fascination. They later moved to the United States, hoping to find a greater degree of anonymity. For a while, it seemed that Alfonso had made the right choice. He was free. He had the woman he loved, a woman who doted on him and devoted herself utterly to his care. But the grand romantic gesture of renouncing a throne is one thing. The day-to-day reality of building a life in its aftermath is quite another. The fairy tale ending that the newspapers had written for them soon began to collide with the harsh prose of real life. The first strain was financial. While they were far from poor, Alfonso had a substantial allowance from his father's personal fortune. They were no longer living on the budget of a royal house. They had to manage their own affairs, and the constant, expensive medical care Alfonso required was a significant drain on their resources. A more significant strain was social. They were caught between two worlds. Edelmira was not accepted by the exiled European aristocracy who saw her as an interloper. Alfonso, having given up his royal status, was now a figure of curiosity, a man who didn't quite fit in anywhere. But the greatest, most corrosive strain of all was the one that had been there from the very beginning, his hemophilia. The relentless, daily, grinding reality of his illness began to wear away at the foundations of their marriage. The thrilling romance of saving a fragile prince gave way to the exhausting, terrifying, and unglamorous work of being a full-time nurse to a chronic invalid. Every plan was contingent on his health. Every trip was fraught with risk. Every minor stumble was a potential catastrophe. The grand sacrifice had been made, but the difficult, painful business of living with its consequences was just beginning. The cracks in their paradise were starting to appear. The grand romantic gesture of renouncing a throne is a single dramatic act immortalized in headlines and history books. But the quiet, unglamorous business of living with the consequences of that act is a long, slow, and often grinding affair. For Alfonso, Count of Covadonga, and his new wife Edelmira, the Countess, the fairy tale that had captivated the world began to fray under the relentless pressure of reality. Their life in the years following their celebrated 1933 wedding was a slow-motion collision between the fantasy of their romance and the harsh, unyielding facts of Alfonso's medical condition. After leaving the gossiping courts in exile of Europe, They sought anonymity and a fresh start in the United States, settling for a time in New York. But anonymity was a luxury they could not afford. They were still figures of immense public curiosity, their every move chronicled by a fascinated press. This constant scrutiny exacerbated the internal strains that were beginning to develop in their marriage. The fundamental challenge was the one that had been there all along: Alfonso's hemophilia. In the throes of their courtship in Lausanne, Edelmira had bravely accepted the role of his caregiver, but the reality of that role, day in and day out, was a burden of almost unimaginable weight. Imagine their life. Every single day was a calculated risk. A walk in Central Park was an exercise in vigilance, watching for uneven pavement or a careless passerby. A simple dinner party was fraught with the danger of a bumped elbow or a fall on a polished floor. Edelmira's life, once that of a vibrant and independent woman, was now entirely subsumed by his. She was no longer just a wife. She was a 24-hour-a-day nurse, a sentry guarding against a world of sharp corners. Her conversations were dominated by his health, her schedule dictated by his good days and bad days, her sleep interrupted by the fear of a nocturnal bleed. The passionate lover had become a permanent warden. It was an exhausting, terrifying, and isolating existence. The spontaneity and joy that had defined their early romance were slowly being suffocated by a blanket of medical anxiety. For Alfonso, the psychological toll was just as severe. The man who had given up a kingdom to be a husband now found himself in the role of a permanent patient. He was acutely aware of the burden he placed on his wife. He saw the toll it was taking on her, the worry etched into her face. This likely created a deep sense of guilt and frustration, a feeling of inadequacy and dependence that would be poisonous for any marriage, let alone one born of such a grand sacrifice. He had chosen this life of normalcy, but his body refused to cooperate. He could never be a normal husband, a man who could protect and provide for his wife in the traditional sense. Instead, he was the one who always needed protecting. The power dynamic of their relationship, once balanced by love, was now irrevocably skewed by his illness. Financial pressures added another layer of stress. While his father provided a generous allowance, they did not have the bottomless resources of a reigning monarchy. The costs of Alfonso's constant medical consultations, treatments, and the need for a lifestyle of extreme caution were substantial. They were living the life of high society figures, but without the institutional support that had once surrounded him. The glamorous Count and Countess of Covadonga were, behind the scenes, dealing with the mundane and stressful realities of budgets and medical bills. In a last-ditch effort to salvage their marriage, they decided to move to Havana, Cuba, in 1937. The logic was clear. This was Edelmira's home. Here, surrounded by her family, her culture, and the warm, familiar rhythms of Cuban life, perhaps she could find some relief from the pressures of being his sole caregiver. Perhaps the tropical sun could thaw the chill that had settled over their relationship. But a change of scenery cannot cure a fundamental incompatibility, especially one exacerbated by chronic illness. The problems that had started in New York followed them to Havana. The move only served to highlight the chasm that had grown between them. After 4 years of marriage, the great love story that had begun with such defiance and passion had run its course. In a Havana courtroom, the union was quietly dissolved. The prince who gave up a throne for love was now divorced. The sacrifice seemed, in retrospect, to have been in vain. What followed was a period of desperate, almost reckless behavior for Alfonso. He was now 30 years old, heartbroken, and utterly adrift. He had renounced his family, his country, and his destiny for a love that had failed. His sense of identity, already fractured by exile and illness, was now completely shattered. It is perhaps not surprising, then, that he immediately threw himself into another whirlwind romance. He was a man drowning in loneliness, desperately grasping for a life raft. Just a few months after his divorce from Edelmira was finalized on July 3, 1937, he married again once more in Havana. His second wife was Marta Esther Rocafort Altuzarra, a beautiful Cuban model who was a fixture in Havana's glamorous and fast-paced social scene. If Edelmira had represented a kind of grounded, nurturing stability, Marta represented excitement, glamour, and perhaps a willful denial of reality. Theirs was a romance of the moment, a passionate, impulsive fling that quickly escalated into marriage. For Alfonso, it was likely an attempt to outrun his own sorrow, to prove to the world and to himself that he was still desirable, still capable of finding happiness. For Marta, marrying a former prince, even a disinherited one, carried an undeniable allure and prestige. But this marriage was a house built on sand. The fundamental problems of Alfonso's life had not gone away. He was still a severe hemophiliac, and the daily reality of his condition was something the vibrant socialite lifestyle of a model was completely unequipped to handle. The quiet, careful routines his health demanded were antithetical to the world of late-night parties and social engagements she inhabited. The brief, intoxicating thrill of the romance quickly evaporated when faced with the grim, unglamorous realities of his illness. The marriage was a catastrophic mismatch, and it collapsed with astonishing speed. After just 8 months, in January of 1938, they too were divorced. Alfonso was now twice divorced, a man who had gambled everything on love and lost twice. He was profoundly alone, estranged from his family, and without any clear purpose. He eventually made his way to Miami, Florida. In the late 1930s, Miami was a city of sun-drenched escapism, a playground for the wealthy, the famous, and those looking to forget their pasts. It was a perfect place for a man like Alfonso to disappear. He rented a house and tried to create a semblance of a life, but he was a man haunted by the ghosts of what might have been. He was known in the Miami social scene as the Count of Covadonga, a title that was more of a curiosity than a mark of real status. It was here, in this city of fleeting pleasures, that his most self-destructive tendencies came to the fore. He had a passion for fast cars. For a man whose entire life had been defined by physical caution and restraint, the thrill of speed, the feeling of power and control behind the wheel of a roaring engine, must have been an irresistible form of release. It was an act of profound rebellion against the cotton wool existence of his youth and the constant limitations of his body. It was a way of feeling intensely, dangerously alive. It was also, for a hemophiliac, a form of slow-motion suicide, a fatalistic dance with the very kind of sudden, violent trauma his body could not withstand. The final act of his tragedy played out on the night of September 6, 1938. Alfonso had been out for the evening, socializing, trying to fill the empty hours. He was driving his car, a powerful Ford V8, down one of Miami's main arteries, Biscayne Boulevard. In the passenger seat was a 23-year-old woman named Mildred Mimi Mary Gaydon, a nightclub hostess or barmaid, a final poignant symbol of how far he had fallen from the world of European princesses. The details of what happened next are murky, but the outcome was brutally clear. It was late. He was likely driving too fast. He allegedly swerved to avoid a truck, lost control of the car, and it careened off the road, slamming with terrific force into a telephone pole. The sound of the impact, a violent shriek of metal and shattering glass, would have cut through the warm, humid night air. In the immediate aftermath, the scene would have been deceptively calm. His companion Mildred was shaken and bruised, but had miraculously escaped serious harm. Alfonso himself was conscious and talking. He reportedly had some visible cuts and a broken nose, but to the bystanders who rushed to help, his injuries did not appear to be life-threatening. This was the terrifying, insidious nature of his disease. The real damage was unseen, a catastrophic explosion of violence that had occurred deep within his body. When he was rushed to Miami's Jackson Memorial Hospital, the medical team on duty would have initially assessed him as a serious but survivable traffic accident victim. But as soon as they learned his identity and his medical history, they would have known they were facing an impossible situation. The blunt force trauma of the crash, the impact of his body against the steering wheel and the dashboard, had caused massive internal injuries. His spleen or liver had likely ruptured, and he was hemorrhaging profusely into his abdominal cavity. For a normal patient, surgeons could have operated, stopped the bleeding, and saved his life. But for Alfonso, surgery was impossible. His blood would not clot. Every incision would be an uncontrollable wound. There were no stores of plasma, no clotting factor concentrates that are the staples of modern hemophilia care. All the doctors could do was make him comfortable and watch, helplessly, as his life drained away internally. The boy who had been so obsessively shielded from every sharp corner and hard surface, the prince who had lived his life in a padded fortress, had been killed by a force so common and brutal that it claims lives every day. It was the ultimate tragic irony. His lifelong invisible enemy had waited patiently, and in a final violent moment on a Miami boulevard, it had claimed its victory. Alfonso, the former Prince of Asturias, the Count of Covadonga, the man who chose a heart over a crown, died in the early hours of the morning from internal bleeding. He was just 31 years old. His life, which had begun with the thunderous salute of royal cannons, ended in the sterile silence of a hospital room, a world away from the home he could never reclaim. So what, in the end, did his tragic story truly mean? His life can be seen as a series of devastating what-ifs, but his most significant impact was completely unintentional. By renouncing the throne for love, Alfonso cleared the line of succession. This single act directly paved the way for his younger, healthier brother, Juan, and ultimately for his nephew, Juan Carlos I, to become king in 1975. It was King Juan Carlos I who masterfully guided Spain from the Franco dictatorship to the modern democracy it is today. Without Alfonso's heartbreaking love affair, the history of modern Spain could have been vastly different. His personal story is a powerful reminder that royalty doesn't shield you from human tragedy. He was trapped in a gilded cage, not just by his title, but by his own genetics. He was a prince defined not by the crown he was meant to wear, but by the one he chose to cast aside. And for that, his life, though short and tragic, left an indelible mark on the history of his nation.